The bridge of the USS Endeavour fell silent as the sensors registered an impossibility. Captain David Morrison leaned forward in his command chair, eyes narrowing at the view screen where space itself was tearing open. Not a wormhole, not a spatial anomaly he recognized from any Starfleet database. This was something else entirely. "Report," he ordered, his voice steady despite the crawling sensation up his spine. Lieutenant Commander Givran, his Andorian science officer, worked frantically at his console. His antennae twitched with agitation. "Captain, I'm reading a massive subspace disruption. The fabric of space-time is literally ripping apart. Energy signatures are off the scale. Nothing in our database matches this phenomenon." The tear widened, bleeding purple and crimson light into the black of space. Reality screamed as something colossal pushed through from somewhere that shouldn't exist. First came the prow, a Gothic monstrosity of metal and stone, adorned with eagle iconography and what appeared to be actual cathedral architecture bolted to its hull. Then more of the vessel emerged, kilometers upon kilometers of armored brutality that made the Endeavour look like a shuttlecraft by comparison. "My God," Morrison whispered. The thing dwarfed anything he'd ever seen, even Borg cubes. But where Borg ships possessed a cold, geometric menace, this vessel radiated something worse religious fury made manifest in steel. More ships followed. Cruisers and destroyers, each one massive, each one bearing the same eagle emblems and Gothic architecture. They moved with ponderous grace, their hulls scarred by what looked like centuries of warfare. Weapons batteries the size of city blocks tracked across the void with predatory intent. "Captain, they're scanning us," Givran reported. "Multiple sensor sweeps, incredibly powerful. They're cutting through our shields like they're not even there." Morrison straightened. "Hail them, all frequencies." The communications officer worked his console, then shook his head. "No response, Captain. They're not even acknowledging our signals." On the view screen, the lead vessel, the cathedral ship that had emerged first, rotated slowly. Gun ports opened along its flanks like the eyes of some ancient predator. Morrison felt his stomach drop. He'd seen that movement before, in combat simulations. That was a ship preparing to fire. Red alert, shields to maximum, evasive. The universe turned white. Lance batteries fired from the Imperial flagship, spears of coherent light that crossed the distance in microseconds. The first strike hit the Endeavour's shields and didn't just penetrate them, it erased them. The second strike carved through the saucer section like a scalpel through flesh. The third strike hit the engineering hull and converted the warp core into an expanding sphere of plasma. The USS Endeavour, a Nebula-class starship that represented decades of Federation engineering, ceased to exist in 2.3 seconds. 400 miles away, on the observation station Sentinel-7, Commander David Marcus watched the destruction through long-range sensors. His hands trembled as he activated the emergency subspace beacon. "This is Commander Marcus of Station Sentinel-7 to Starfleet Command. Unknown hostile forces have entered Federation space. The Endeavour has been destroyed. I repeat, the Endeavour has been destroyed with all hands. These ships are beyond anything in our tactical database. Requesting immediate." The station's proximity alarms shrieked. Marcus looked up to see one of the smaller hostile vessels bearing down on his position. He never finished his message. The Imperial destroyer's macro cannons spoke once, and Sentinel-7 joined the Endeavour in oblivion. Aboard the bridge of the Emperor's Wrath, rogue trader Erasmus Harlock observed the Xenos vessel's destruction with satisfaction. He was a tall man, augmented with the finest cybernetics his dynasty's wealth could purchase. His left eye had been replaced with an ornate targeting lens, his right arm with a mechanical limb of exquisite craftsmanship. He wore the traditional garb of his station, a coat of crimson and gold that would have seemed absurdly Baroque to Federation eyes, but was understated by Imperial standards. "Pathetically weak," he murmured. Their void shields collapsed from a single lance strike. Beside him, Commissar Volker Steiner stood rigid in his black greatcoat and peaked cap. The gold aquila on his chest caught the light from the bridge's countless monitors and candles. Yes, Candles opened flames on a starship bridge because the Imperium saw no contradiction in mixing medieval aesthetics with weapons that could crack planets. "They are Xenos, Lord Trader," Steiner said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "They possess technology that violates the sacred human form. Look at their ships, no proper architecture, no shrines to the God Emperor. They are abominations that must be cleansed." Harlock nodded slowly. His dynasty had traded with aliens before, in the dark spaces between stars where the Imperium's laws meant less than profit. But this, deep into what his navigators insisted, was an entirely different region of space, possibly even a different dimension he couldn't afford to appear anything less than orthodoxly faithful. "Indeed, Commissar. Signal the fleet. We advance on the nearest population center. The God Emperor's light will shine upon this benighted sector." In the ship's navigator chamber, sealed behind layers of blessed ceramite and ancient wards, Navigator Sibyl Orantius opened her third eye and gazed into the roiling madness of the warp. What she saw made her ancient blood run cold. This place was wrong. The Imperium here felt different, quieter somehow, less turbulent. The Astronomican's light was completely absent, a void where the Emperor's beacon should shine. Without that guiding light, navigating the warp was like sailing an ocean in absolute darkness. She had tried to warn Lord Harlock that the fleet should return to known space immediately, but the rogue trader's ambitions had overruled her caution. Now they were committed. The fleet could make short warp jumps using the ship's cogitators, but without the Astronomican and with the strange properties of this dimension's warp, any strategic movement would be guesswork and peril. They were effectively stranded unless they found another way home. The Imperial fleet set course for the nearest major population center their augurs had detected, a world the inhabitants called Vulcan. At Starfleet headquarters in San Francisco, Admiral Nakamura took the emergency transmission with the calm that came from 40 years of service. Then he played it back and felt that calm shatter like glass. "Get me the Federation president," he ordered, "and activate the emergency protocols. I want every ship within 10 light years of the Vulcan sector to converge on those coordinates immediately." His aide, a young lieutenant who'd never seen combat, stammered, "Sir, with all due respect, we don't know if this is a legitimate threat. It could be a sensor malfunction. Or, the Endeavor doesn't just disappear, Lieutenant. Neither does Sentinel-7. Nakamura pulled up the tactical display. The Vulcan system glowed amber on the screen, one of the founding worlds of the Federation, home to 6 billion souls. And if these ships are heading where I think they're heading, we're about to face something we're completely unprepared for. On Vulcan, in the city of Shikar, High Administrator Tavala stood in her chambers and felt the mental touch of millions of minds in the planetary psi network. At 187 years old, she had survived the Romulan Wars, the Klingon conflicts, and countless other crises through pure Vulcan logic and discipline. But what she sensed now defied logical categorization. The sky above Vulcan turned wrong. Massive ships dropped out of warp, no, not warp, something else, and took up positions in high orbit. They were grotesque things, covered in eagles and skulls and what appeared to be actual Gothic cathedrals bolted to their hulls. The largest vessel was 15 kilometers long, a city in space, bristling with weapons that tracked across the planet's surface with mechanical precision. Tavala activated her communicator. "This is High Administrator Tavala to Vulcan Defense Command. Unknown vessels have entered orbit. Their intentions are unclear, but their weapons are active. Raise planetary shields and scramble all defense platforms." The response came immediately. "Shields are up, Administrator. We're reading 47 hostile vessels. Mass and firepower exceed anything in our database by an order of magnitude." On the bridge of the Emperor's Wrath, Harlock studied the planet below. Scans revealed a prosperous world, technologically advanced by local standards but primitive by imperial measure. Billions of souls living in ignorance of the God Emperor's light. He could see cities that stretched for hundreds of miles, orbital platforms, defense satellites. "Commissar, open a channel. Let them hear the Emperor's judgment." Steiner activated the Voxcasters, and his voice boomed across every communications frequency the planet possessed, translated automatically by the ship's cogitators into the local languages. "Attention, Xenos inhabitants of this world. You stand in violation of the God Emperor's sacred domain. Your technology is heretical. Your very existence is an affront to the purity of mankind. You will submit to Imperial authority immediately, or face righteous extermination. You have 1 hour to respond. In the Vulcan High Command Center, Talaran, the planet's defense coordinator, listened to the message with growing incomprehension. The logic of it was absent. These beings claimed religious authority over space itself, demanded submission based on theological grounds, and threatened genocide as casually as one might discuss the weather. The speaker is experiencing significant psychological dysfunction, Talaran observed. Religious delusions of cosmic scale, megalomania, paranoid xenophobia. Recommend we open negotiations and offer psychiatric assistance. Tavala, listening from her chambers, felt the first stirring of something Vulcans rarely experienced: fear. Not for herself, she had lived more than a century and accepted death with equanimity, but for her people. For all people. Negative, she said quietly. These are not individuals experiencing mental illness. This is their civilization's operating framework. Open hailing frequencies, all channels. Let us attempt reason. The hour passed. The Vulcans transmitted messages of peace, offers of dialogue, explanations of the Federation's principles. They received no response except the steady drone of Imperial hymns broadcast across all frequencies, prayers to an emperor god they'd never heard of, litanies of hate against aliens and machines, and countless other sins they didn't understand. When the hour ended, Harlock gave the order without hesitation. Begin orbital bombardment. Lance batteries. Fire at will. Target population centers first. The Emperor's wrath spoke with the voice of apocalypse. Lance batteries fired, each one channeling enough energy to vaporize a mountain. The beams punched through Vulcan's planetary shields, like they were soap bubbles, carved into the cities below with surgical precision. Shikar's central district simply ceased to exist, replaced by a crater of molten glass 3 miles wide. Tavala and everyone in the government complex died instantly, their bodies converted to ash and plasma. More lances fired. The city of Kir simply vanished. Vulcana Regar burned. The ancient temple complexes of Mount Selea, standing for millennia, crumbled as orbital strikes reduced them to rubble. Defense platforms returned fire with phasers and torpedoes, but the Imperial void shields absorbed the attacks with contemptuous ease. Talaran, in the hardened command bunker 300 feet below the surface, watched his people die by the millions. Sensors showed heat signatures winking out by the thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Cities burning, orbital platforms destroyed, the planetary shields failing under the sustained bombardment. All units, fall back to secondary positions, he ordered, his voice cracking despite decades of emotional control. Evacuate all major population centers. This is not a battle we can win. But there was nowhere to evacuate to. The orbital bombardment was systematic, methodical, inexorable. The Imperial fleet worked its way across Vulcan's surface like an exterminator dealing with an infestation. When ships tried to flee the planet, Imperial destroyers hunted them down with casual efficiency. In space, the first Starfleet reinforcements arrived, a task force of 12 ships led by the USS Excalibur. Captain Mackenzie Calhoun, a Xenexian warrior who'd fought his way up through Starfleet's ranks, took one look at the burning planet and the monstrous vessels in orbit and made his decision. All ships, attack formation Delta, target the nearest hostile vessel, maximum firepower. The Starfleet ships dove toward the Imperial fleet, phasers blazing. Photon torpedoes streaked across the void, quantum torpedoes following behind them. The Federation's best weapons, fired with desperate precision. The Imperial void shields flickered with rainbow light as they absorbed the attacks. That was all, just flickered. Impossible, whispered Calhoun's tactical officer. We hit them with enough firepower to destroy a Borg cube. The shields didn't even weaken. Calhoun's jaw tightened. All ships, concentrate fire on a single target, focus everything on. An Imperial cruiser turned toward the Starfleet formation. Its broadside batteries spoke, and the universe turned to fire. Macrocannons hurled shells the size of shuttlecraft at appreciable fractions of light speed. Lance batteries carved coherent light through the vacuum. The USS Magellan took a direct hit and broke in half. The USS Sutherland simply exploded. The USS Antares managed to get its shields up, but they failed in seconds, and the ship tumbled away, trailing atmosphere and bodies. "Evasive maneuvers," Calhoun roared. "All ships break and scatter," but the Imperial vessels were already tracking them. Targeting solutions calculated by cogitators that had been processing warfare data for 10,000 years. Weapons blessed by tech priests and consecrated with the blood of saints. Void shields maintained by savants who viewed reality itself as an obstacle to be overcome through faith and engineering. The Excalibur's shields collapsed under sustained lance fire. Calhoun felt the deck heave beneath him as power conduits exploded across the ship. "Return fire. All weapons." They got off one more salvo before a macro cannon shell punched through the engineering section. The warp core went critical. Calhoun had just enough time to activate the evacuation alarm before the antimatter containment failed. Of the 12 Federation ships that had engaged the Imperial fleet, 3 survived to retreat, 9 ships destroyed, 4,000 Starfleet personnel dead. And they hadn't managed to destroy a single Imperial vessel, hadn't even depleted one ship's shields significantly. On Vulcan's surface, the bombardment continued for another 6 hours. By the time the Imperial fleet ceased fire, 6 billion Vulcans had been reduced to 2 million survivors, hiding in deep shelters and remote outposts. The planet's major cities were gone. Its infrastructure was rubble. The homeworld of logic and reason had been transformed into a smoldering graveyard. In the command bunker, Talaran received the final damage reports with hands that shook despite all his training. 99% casualties. 99% of his people dead. He had lived through the Dominion War, through battles against the Borg, through countless crises. Nothing had prepared him for this. "Send a priority transmission to Starfleet Command," he said, his voice hollow. "Vulcan has fallen. Unknown hostile forces possess weapons and defenses far beyond our capabilities. Recommend immediate evacuation of all core worlds within their projected path. We cannot stop them." He paused, then added with the last remnants of Vulcan dignity, "And tell them we died in the service of logic." It simply wasn't enough. In San Francisco, Admiral Nakamura received Talaran's transmission in the middle of an emergency session of Starfleet Command. The room fell silent as the images from Vulcan played across the main screen. Cities reduced to craters, defense platforms torn apart, Starfleet ships exploding like toys. "Dear God," someone whispered. Nakamura, a man who'd fought Cardassians and Romulans and Borg, felt something he'd never experienced before: true existential terror. Not fear of death, he'd made peace with that decades ago, but fear that everything they'd built, everything the Federation stood for, might simply cease to exist. "How many ships do they have?" he asked quietly. "Initial scans show 47 capital ships, Admiral, each one massing between 5 and 15 kilometers. Weapons output exceeds our most powerful vessels by factors we're still calculating. And their shields." The tactical officer swallowed. "Sir, we hit them with everything we had. We didn't even scratch them." "Where are they heading now?" "They're holding position in Vulcan orbit, Admiral, setting up what appears to be occupation infrastructure." The officer brought up long-range scans. "They're deploying smaller craft to the surface. Thousands of them." Nakamura leaned forward. "What kind of craft?" "Troop transports, Admiral. They're landing ground forces. On Vulcan's shattered surface, Imperial Guard regiments descended from orbit in heavily armored landers that punched through the ash-choked atmosphere like meteors. The Cadian 117th, the Catachan 3rd, the Krieg 88th Death Corps, 20,000 Imperial Guardsmen, armed and armored for urban warfare, blessed by commissars and priests, ready to bring compliance to a hostile world. What they found were scattered survivors, traumatized by orbital bombardment, no capacity for organized resistance. The Vulcans attempted to communicate, to negotiate, to apply reason to an unreasonable situation. The Imperial Guard shot anyone who didn't immediately prostrate themselves before the Aquila banners. In the ruins of Shikar, Commissar Steiner walked through streets of glassy rubble, past bodies burned beyond recognition, and felt satisfaction at a job well begun. This world would serve the Emperor, or it would serve as an example. Either outcome was acceptable. He found a group of survivors huddled in a collapsed building, Vulcans attempting to treat wounded with whatever medical supplies they'd salvaged. They looked up as the Commissar approached, their faces showing the strain of trying to process incomprehensible horror through purely logical frameworks that had no category for religious genocide. "Please," one of them said, a female Vulcan whose robes were stained with green blood. "We need medical assistance. We have wounded. We mean you no harm." Steiner looked at her with cold eyes. "You are Xenos. You possess no rights before the throne. Your wounded will die so that humanity may prosper. This is the Emperor's will." He drew his bolt pistol and fired once. The Vulcan woman's head exploded in a spray of green blood and bone. The others barely had time to react before the guardsmen following Steiner opened fire with lasguns, cutting them down with beams of coherent light. This scene repeated itself across Vulcan's surface. The Imperial Guard didn't take prisoners. They established a perimeter, set up forward bases, and began the systematic extermination of everyone they encountered. Within 72 hours, the 2 million survivors of the orbital bombardment had been reduced to a few thousand scattered individuals hiding in the deepest shelters, cut off from all communication, waiting for rescue that wouldn't come. At Starfleet headquarters, the Federation Council convened an emergency session. Representatives from dozens of worlds filled the chamber, their faces showing shock, grief, and growing panic. The president of the Federation, a human woman named Thelianaris Thevorithishria Thel for short, stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled leaders. "Vulcan is lost," she said simply. 6 billion dead. Our fleet suffered catastrophic losses. These unknown hostiles possess technology that makes our weapons ineffective and their defenses impenetrable. She paused, letting that sink in. "We have received a transmission from their leadership. I believe you all need to hear it." The recording played. Harlock's voice, cold and certain, echoed through the chamber. "This sector is now under Imperial jurisdiction. All Xeno civilizations will submit to the authority of the God Emperor of mankind or face extermination. Resistance is heresy. Negotiation is heresy. Your very existence is an affront to the purity of human dominion. You will kneel, or you will die." Silence followed. Then the Andorian ambassador stood, his antennae rigid with fury. "This is insanity. Religious zealotry on a cosmic scale. We cannot negotiate with such madness." The Tellarite representative shook his head. "We must negotiate. We have no choice. Their weapons are beyond anything we can counter." "Negotiation implies they want something from us," said the human admiral from Starfleet Command. "These beings don't want anything except our extinction. They stated it clearly they consider aliens to be an affront to their religious beliefs." President Thel raised her hand for silence. "The question before us is simple. How do we survive? Starfleet's initial engagement was a disaster. Our weapons can't penetrate their defenses. They can destroy our ships at will. Vulcan is proof of what they'll do to our worlds." She took a breath. "I'm open to suggestions." What she didn't say, what everyone in that chamber understood, was that the Federation, built on principles of peace and exploration and diplomacy, was facing an existential threat that those principles couldn't address. You couldn't reason with religious fanaticism. You couldn't negotiate with beings who viewed your existence as a sin, and you couldn't fight enemies whose technology rendered yours obsolete. The Federation, for the first time in its history, faced the very real possibility of complete annihilation. And in San Francisco, in Paris, on Andoria and Tellar, and Earth and 100 other worlds, people looked up at the stars and wondered if they'd just become prey in a universe far crueler than they'd ever imagined. The age of exploration was over. The age of survival had begun. The emergency briefing room, deep beneath Starfleet headquarters, was a place few officers even knew existed. Admiral William Ross stood at the head of the table, his face haggard from 72 hours without sleep. Around him sat the surviving senior command staff and 3 individuals whose presence was highly irregular operatives whose affiliation Ross wouldn't name aloud. but everyone recognized the signs of Section 31's involvement. A nondescript man who identified himself only as Mr. Sloan sat with his hands folded, watching the admirals with predatory patience. He was unremarkable looking, which was precisely the point. Beside him sat two other operatives, equally forgettable, equally dangerous. They didn't sit at the main table. Section 31 never officially existed, but their presence in the room spoke volumes about how desperate things had become. "Vulcan is gone," Ross said without preamble. 6 billion dead. Our conventional response failed catastrophically. 9 ships destroyed in the first engagement, and we didn't even damage one of theirs. He looked around the table. "Gentlemen, ladies, we're looking at extinction, not conquest. Not occupation, extinction. These Imperials don't want territory, they want us dead because their religion says we shouldn't exist." Captain Jean-Luc Picard, recalled from the Enterprise E, spoke quietly. "Surely there must be some avenue for communication. Every species, no matter how hostile, has had something they wanted. The Borg wanted assimilation. The Dominion wanted order. Even the Romulans." "Captain Picard," Sloan interrupted, his voice soft but cutting. "With all due respect to your diplomatic accomplishments, these beings are not interested in what you have to say. They've made that abundantly clear. Their opening move was to vaporize a founding world of the Federation. Their second move was to slaughter every survivor they could find. They don't want prisoners. They don't want slaves. They want extermination." Picard's jaw tightened. "Then what do you propose?" "I propose we stop fighting a war based on Federation ideals and start fighting a war based on survival." Sloan stood, activating a holographic display. "My organization has been analyzing their vessels, their tactics, their transmissions. We've learned several things. First, they come from somewhere else, possibly another dimension, based on the spatial anomaly they emerged from. Second, their technology operates on principles we don't fully understand. But it's not magic. It can be countered. Third, and most importantly, they're not invincible. They're just more ruthless than we've been willing to be." Admiral Nechayev, known as one of Starfleet's hardliners, leaned forward. "Explain." "Their ships are vulnerable to sustained, coordinated assault. We just need more firepower focused on single targets. Their ground forces, while heavily armed, can be isolated and destroyed through asymmetric warfare. Their supply lines stretch back through that dimensional tear, which means they can be cut." Sloan's eyes were cold. "But none of this matters if we keep fighting like the Federation. We need to fight like them without mercy, without hesitation, and without the limitations of the Prime Directive." "You're talking about war crimes," Picard said, his voice hard. "I'm talking about survival, Captain. The Imperials don't recognize the laws of war. They don't take prisoners except to torture them for information. They don't spare civilians. They don't honor surrenders. If we fight them with one hand tied behind our backs, we will die, every single one of us." The room fell silent. Finally, Admiral Ross spoke. "Unconventional operations against Imperial forces will be coordinated through specialized channels. Admiral Nechayev will liaise on strategic planning. Captains, you're dismissed. Picard, stay behind." As the others filed out, Ross looked at Picard with something approaching pity. "Jean-Luc, I know this goes against everything you believe in, everything Starfleet stands for, but we're facing an enemy that makes the Borg look merciful. I need your tactical mind, your experience, but I need you to understand the rules have changed." Picard stood rigid. "If we abandon our principles to survive, Admiral, what exactly are we surviving for?" "The chance to rebuild them later," Ross said quietly. "If there is a later." 2 weeks after Vulcan's fall, the USS Enterprise E received its new orders. Picard read them 3 times, each reading making his stomach turn. The mission was simple on paper. Locate Imperial supply convoys and destroy them. Acceptable collateral damage. Unlimited. Rules of engagement. None. Commander Worf, standing beside Picard's ready room desk, read over his captain's shoulder. The Klingon's expression was unreadable. "These orders contradict Starfleet regulations in 17 specific ways. I'm aware, Number 1. They also contradict the Federation Charter, The Prime Directive and the Khitomer Accords. I'm aware of that as well. Picard looked up at his first officer. What would you do, Worf? The Klingon was silent for a long moment. My people have a saying. 4,000 throats may be cut in one night by a running man. It means that honor sometimes requires ugly choices. The Imperials have proven themselves dishonorable enemies. They deserve no mercy. He paused. But you are not Klingon, Captain. You are a man who believes in principles. If you follow these orders, you will damage something in yourself that cannot easily be repaired. And if I don't follow them, we may all die. Yes, that is the choice before you. Picard stood, looking out the viewport at the stars. How many times had he stood here, contemplating the mysteries of the universe, secure in his belief that reason and compassion would always find a way. Now those stars held enemies that viewed compassion as weakness and reason as heresy. Inform the crew, he said finally. We have new orders. And Worf, prepare security teams for boarding actions. We may need to get our hands dirty. The Enterprise found its first target 3 days later, an Imperial convoy of transport ships guarded by a single destroyer. The vessels were carrying supplies to the occupation forces on Vulcan. Food, ammunition, medical supplies. And, according to long-range scans, approximately 2,000 human crew and support personnel. Humans, not aliens, not Xenos. Humans who worshipped an emperor god and believed the Federation deserved extermination, but humans nonetheless. Picard stood on the bridge, watching the convoy on the main view screen. Beside him, Tactical Officer Lieutenant Commander Daniels waited for orders. The young man's hands hovered over his console, ready to unleash the Enterprise's weapons. Captain, Daniels prompted. Every instinct Picard possessed screamed at him to hail the ships, to offer them a chance to surrender, to find some alternative to what Section 31 wanted him to do. But he remembered Vulcan burning, remembered 6 billion dead, remembered that these same humans would show no mercy to any Federation ship they encountered. Target the destroyer's engines, he said, his voice flat. Maximum firepower. Disable it, then destroy the transports. Sir, the transports are unarmed. They'll have no... I'm aware, Lieutenant. Fire when ready. The Enterprise's phasers lanced out, joined by quantum torpedoes. The Imperial destroyer's void shields held for several seconds, then collapsed under the sustained assault. With its engines destroyed, the ship drifted helplessly. The transports tried to scatter, but they were slow, ungainly vessels designed for cargo, not combat. The Enterprise systematically destroyed them. One after another, the transports exploded or broke apart, spilling cargo and bodies into the vacuum. 2,000 humans died in the span of 4 minutes. Picard watched it all, forcing himself not to look away. If he was going to give these orders, he would witness the consequences. When it was over, Worf quietly said, "The destroyer is still functional, Captain. Minimal crew casualties. They're attempting to restore power. Destroy it. Captain, they're no longer a threat. We could destroy it, Commander." That's an order. The Enterprise fired again. The Imperial destroyer's reactor went critical, and 600 more humans died in a flash of light and heat. In his ready room afterward, Picard sat alone in the dark, a glass of Chateau Picard untouched on his desk. He'd just committed what any court would consider a war crime. The transports had been unarmed. The destroyer had been disabled. Neither posed an immediate threat. He'd killed them anyway because Section 31 said the Imperials couldn't be allowed to resupply, couldn't be allowed any mercy, couldn't be allowed to think the Federation would hesitate. The door chimed. "Come." Counselor Troy entered, her empathic senses undoubtedly screaming at the emotional turmoil radiating from her captain. She sat across from him without speaking, simply being present. "I murdered them, Deanna," Picard said finally. "Not in battle, not in self-defense. I murdered 2,000 people who couldn't fight back. You followed orders designed to protect the Federation. That's what every war criminal says. I was following orders. It was necessary. They would have done worse to us." He looked at her with haunted eyes. "Where does it end? How many more will I have to kill? How much of my soul do I have to sacrifice before we've sacrificed everything we stood for?" Troy had no answer. Because the truth was, she didn't know. None of them did. Across the Federation, the descent continued. On Starbase 375, Admiral Ross approved the development of biogenic weapons banned since the 24th century. In the Utopia Planitia shipyards above Mars, engineers worked on designs that incorporated Borg technology assimilation nanoprobes weaponized, adapted for use against the Imperial's armored soldiers. On Earth, the Federation Council quietly suspended habeas corpus in occupied territories. And in the shadows, Section 31 went to work with the kind of ruthless efficiency they'd always possessed but had never been allowed to fully unleash. Through back channels and anonymous directives, operations were coordinated across 24 sectors, each one pushing the boundaries of what the Federation had once considered acceptable. On Deneva, operatives working without official authorization identified a collaborator, a human merchant who'd opened communications with Imperial forces, offering to provide intelligence in exchange for his family's safety. The operatives didn't arrest him. They simply made him disappear, along with his family. The message was clear. Collaboration meant death, and the Federation would no longer be bound by trials or evidence. On Rigel the 7th, an Imperial forward operating base's water supply was contaminated with chemical agents. 200 Imperial guardsmen died choking on their own blood. When the Imperials responded by executing Rigelian civilians in retaliation, those coordinating the operation considered it an acceptable trade. The war became a spiral of atrocity and counter-atrocity, each side justifying their actions by pointing to the enemy's brutality. But there was a fundamental asymmetry. The Imperials had always fought this way. For the Federation, every step down that path was a step away from everything they'd built. On Deep Space Nine, Captain Benjamin Sisko received orders that made even his hardened wartime instincts rebel. When the Prophets had sensed the existential threat the Imperials posed to Bajor and all linear existence, they had sent Sisko back from the Celestial Temple with a singular purpose: defend the worlds he loved from this extra-dimensional threat. Now, weeks after his miraculous return, he faced orders that tested even his Prophet-touched resolve. The station sat at a strategic choke point between Imperial-occupied space and the Federation core worlds. Starfleet Command wanted it held at any cost. "Any cost, Benjamin," Admiral Ross said over subspace. "You understand what that means?" Sisko understood. It meant Section 31 wanted him to mine the wormhole approaches with biogenic weapons. It meant if Imperial ships came through, he was to release plague torpedoes that would kill every living thing aboard those vessels and leave the ships contaminated for years. It meant crossing lines he'd sworn never to cross. "I understand, Admiral. And I'll do it. But I want it on record that I'm doing this under protest." Protest noted. Ross out. Major Kira Nerys found Sisko in his office 3 hours later, staring at the schematics for the biogenic mines. She'd fought the Cardassians for years, done terrible things in the name of Bajoran freedom, but even she was shocked by what she saw on his screen. "Benjamin, this is genocide. If you deploy these, you're not just killing enemy soldiers. You're creating weapons that could contaminate entire systems." "I know. Then how can you even consider it?" He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much both in this realm and beyond. "Because if I don't, the Imperials will sweep through here, and they'll do to Bajor what they did to Vulcan. 6 billion dead, Nerys. Every man, woman, and child on your world, burned to ash or hunted down by religious fanatics who think you're an affront to their god. The Prophet sent me back for a reason. So yes, I'll deploy weapons that make me sick to even think about. I'll do it because the alternative is extinction." Kira had no response. She'd spent years fighting for her people's freedom, sacrificed her innocence to the resistance, done things that still haunted her. But this was different. This wasn't fighting for freedom, it was fighting to exist at all. "We're becoming them," she said quietly. "No, we're becoming what we need to be to survive. There's a difference." "Is there?" Sisko didn't answer, because he wasn't sure anymore. The biogenic mines went into position 3 days later. DS9's crew worked in shifts, handling the weapons with extreme care, each one aware they were deploying instruments of mass death. Chief O'Brien, normally jovial even in crisis, worked in grim silence. Dr. Bashir refused to participate and was relieved of duty. Odo watched it all with his usual impassivity, but even the changeling seemed disturbed. When the work was done, Cisco stood on the promenade and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Imperial fleet was advancing. Somewhere out there, humans who believed themselves righteous were preparing to commit genocide in the name of their god emperor. And here he stood, having just deployed weapons that could kill billions, telling himself it was necessary. The war had been going for 6 weeks. Already, the Federation had lost Vulcan, 3 colony worlds, and dozens of ships. Already, Starfleet had committed acts that would have been unthinkable 2 months ago, and the Imperials kept coming, relentless as a tide, certain in their faith, unmoved by casualties. At Starfleet Medical on Earth, Dr. Beverly Crusher received a visit from individuals who wouldn't identify their organization. They wanted her expertise in developing biological agents specifically tailored to Imperial physiology. They had samples tissue taken from dead guardsmen, blood scans from captured soldiers who died under interrogation, genetic material harvested from corpses. "You want me to design a plague," she said to the lead operative. "We want you to design a weapon," the man corrected, "something that targets their specific genetic markers. The Imperials are human, but they've been heavily modified genetic augmentation, cybernetic implants, chemical conditioning. We need something that exploits those modifications. I'm a doctor. I took an oath to do no harm. Dr. Crusher, with respect, your oath didn't anticipate a species that wants to exterminate every alien in the galaxy. We need this weapon. People are dying while we have this conversation." She wanted to refuse, wanted to throw him out of her office, report this to Picard, maintain the ethical standards she'd held for her entire career. But she remembered Vulcan burning, remembered the casualty reports, remembered that her son Wesley was serving on a ship somewhere in this war zone, and if the Imperials won, he'd die screaming as his ship was torn apart. "I'll need full lab access and a team," she said, her voice hollow. "And I want it on record that I'm doing this under protest." "Noted. You'll have everything you need within the hour." When he left, Crusher sat alone in her office and wept. For her principles, for her oath, for the line she'd just crossed that could never be uncrossed. She was going to design a weapon that would kill human beings by the thousands, maybe millions. She was going to become everything she'd sworn to oppose. But the alternative was extinction, and she had a son to protect. Across the Federation, similar scenes played out. Engineers designed weapons they'd once considered abominations. Tacticians planned operations that violated every rule of warfare. Diplomats authorized actions that would have resulted in their imprisonment in any court. And ordinary citizens, watching their worlds burn and their fleets destroyed, supported it all because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The Federation had always defined itself by its principles: peace, exploration, cooperation, the belief that reason and compassion could solve any problem. Now those principles were being tested in fire, and they were cracking like glass under pressure. On the bridge of the Enterprise, Picard received notification of his next target, an Imperial supply depot on the former colony of New Montana. Intelligence indicated minimal defenses, but significant stockpiles of ammunition and equipment. Section 31 wanted it destroyed, and they wanted it done in a way that would send a message to the Imperials. "They want us to use tricobalt devices," Worf reported, reading the orders. "Full yield. Tricobalt devices were weapons of last resort, banned in most circumstances because of their devastating power. One device could level a city. Multiple devices could crack a planet's crust. How many are they authorizing?" Picard asked, though he already knew the answer. "Enough to ensure nothing survives within a 100-kilometer radius. Captain, there are Federation citizens on New Montana, colonists who haven't evacuated. The blast radius will—" "I am aware, Commander." Picard closed his eyes. "Hail the colony. Tell them they have 12 hours to evacuate. Anyone who remains after that is considered hostile." It wasn't enough time. He knew it wasn't enough time. But those were his orders, and he was following them because the alternative was to be relieved of command and have someone else carry them out anyway. At least this way he could try to save some lives. 11 hours and 43 minutes later, the Enterprise fired its tri-cobalt devices at New Montana's primary settlement. The weapons punched through the atmosphere and detonated in a chain reaction that lit up the planet's night side like a second sun. The settlement, the supply depot, and 17,000 people, Imperial occupation forces and Federation colonists who couldn't or wouldn't evacuate, simply ceased to exist. Picard watched it all on the main view screen, watched the mushroom clouds rise, watched the shockwaves spread, watched the death toll climb on his tactical displays. "Captain," Data said quietly, "I am detecting distress calls from the colony's outskirts. Survivors requesting assistance. Plot a course away from the planet," Picard said. "Maximum warp." "Sir, the survivors are in Imperial-controlled space. We can't help them. Helm, engage." The Enterprise jumped to warp, leaving the survivors to their fate. Behind them, New Montana burned, and 17,000 more deaths were added to Picard's conscience. In his ready room later, Picard found a message waiting from Admiral Ross. It was brief. "Well done. Imperials are pulling back from 3 systems in your sector. Your actions saved lives. Continue mission parameters. Saved lives by taking lives. Destroyed a colony to protect others. Became a war criminal to preserve the Federation." The logic was impeccable and utterly monstrous. Counselor Troy found him there, staring at the message. She didn't need her empathic abilities to know what he was feeling. It was written on every line of his face. "How many more, Deanna?" he asked. "How many more atrocities before we've become indistinguishable from them?" "I don't know, Captain. I wish I did. The Imperials believe they're righteous. They think they're serving a higher purpose, that their brutality is justified by their faith. What's our excuse? We know better. We've always known better. And yet here we are, matching them atrocity for atrocity. We're trying to survive. At what cost? If we win this war by becoming as monstrous as they are, have we really won?" Troy had no answer. Neither did Picard. Neither did anyone in the Federation who was being forced to confront the gap between their ideals and the reality of total war. On Earth, in the Federation Council chambers, President Thel stood before the assembled representatives and delivered a speech that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "We are at war," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to say. "Not a war of conquest or ideology, but a war of survival. Our enemy seeks not to defeat us, but to exterminate us. They consider our very existence a sin against their God. They have shown no mercy, no compassion, no willingness to negotiate, and so we must respond in kind." She paused, looking out at the faces before her. Representatives from dozens of worlds, all of them struggling with the same questions, the same moral compromises. "Effective immediately, the Federation is suspending the following provisions of our charter: the prohibition on development of biological weapons, the restrictions on genetic augmentation for military purposes, the ban on summary execution of enemy combatants, and the requirement for trials before imprisonment of suspected collaborators. These measures are temporary, to last only for the duration of the current conflict." The chamber erupted. Some representatives stood in protest, others sat in stunned silence. The Vulcan acting representative, one of the few survivors of his world's destruction, simply closed his eyes as if in pain. "I know what I'm asking," Thel continued, raising her voice over the noise. "I know that these measures violate everything we've built, but the alternative is extinction. The Imperials have made that clear. They will not stop. They will not negotiate. They will not show mercy. And if we tie one hand behind our backs while fighting them, we will die. All of us." The vote came 3 hours later. The measures passed by a narrow margin. The Federation, built on principles of peace and cooperation and the rule of law, had just authorized its own descent into darkness. And somewhere in the depths of the intelligence apparatus, those who operated without official sanction watched and planned. Because this was what they'd always known, that when pushed hard enough, any civilization would abandon its principles to survive. The Federation had just proven it was no different from any other power in the galaxy. It had simply taken a sufficiently existential threat to reveal the truth. The war was 6 weeks old, And already the Federation had changed in ways that might never be reversed. The question wasn't whether they'd sacrificed their principles they had. The question was whether they'd sacrifice them for nothing, whether the Imperials would destroy them anyway and leave nothing but a memory of a civilization that abandoned everything it believed in and still lost. On Deep Space Nine, Sisko sat alone in his quarters and thought about his son Jake, evacuated to Earth, safe for now but living in a Federation that was becoming unrecognizable. On the Enterprise, Picard stared at his hands and wondered if he'd ever be able to wash the blood off. On Earth, Beverly Crusher worked late into the night perfecting a plague that would kill millions. And across the border, the Imperial fleet prepared for its next assault, confident in their righteousness, certain in their faith, utterly convinced that the God Emperor blessed their crusade against the Xenos' abominations. The descent into darkness had only just begun. The USS Defiant dropped out of warp in the shadow of an asteroid, its cloak engaged, sensors passive. On the bridge, Captain Benjamin Sisko studied the tactical display with the cold calculation of a man who'd learned to think like an insurgent rather than a fleet commander. 3 months into the war, and Starfleet had stopped fighting like a military and started fighting like the Maquis. Target acquired, reported Lieutenant Nog from Tactical. The young Ferengi's ears twitched with nervous energy. Imperial supply convoy, 5 transport vessels, 2 escort destroyers. They're on a predictable route through the Calandra sector. Commander Worf, on temporary assignment from the Enterprise, studied the formation with approval. Their escort pattern is overconfident. They expect resistance from the front, not ambush from concealed positions. That's because until now, we've been obliging them, Sisko said. Time to change the rules. Nog, prepare transphasic torpedoes. Target the lead destroyer's engine section. Worf, the moment we fire, I want you ready to transport those proximity mines directly into the convoy's path. Aye, Captain. This was the new Starfleet doctrine, written in blood and desperation over the past weeks. No more fleet engagements. No more honorable combat. Hit hard, hit fast, and disappear before the Imperials could bring their overwhelming firepower to bear. The Defiant had been designed to fight the Borg, but it turned out the ship was perfectly suited for guerrilla warfare, small, tough, and deadly when used correctly. Decloak and fire, Sisko ordered. The Defiant materialized behind the Imperial formation like a ghost becoming solid. Its pulse phasers tore into the lead destroyer's engines before the Imperial crew even registered the threat. Transphasic torpedoes technology, borrowed from Admiral Janeway's encounters in the Delta Quadrant, phased through the void shields and detonated inside the ship's hull. The destroyer broke apart in a cascade of secondary explosions. Before the second destroyer could react, Worf transported a dozen proximity mines directly into the convoy's flight path. The transport ships, too massive to maneuver quickly, plowed straight into them. 3 transports exploded. A 4th lost its forward section and tumbled away, trailing atmosphere and debris. Recloak, Sisko snapped. Maximum warp, random heading. The Defiant vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Behind it, the surviving Imperial ships fired blindly into empty space, their sensors unable to track a cloaked vessel. By the time they organized a proper search pattern, the Defiant was 3 light-years away and plotting its next strike. In the ship's wardroom afterward, Sisko gathered his senior staff. The mood was grimly satisfied they'd struck a blow without taking casualties, exactly the kind of victory the Federation needed now. 4 ships destroyed, 1 crippled, Nog reported. Estimated Imperial casualties between 600 and 800. Our damage? None. Cloak held perfectly throughout the engagement. Transporter mines worked as designed, Worf added. We can replicate this tactic across the fleet. Any ship with a transporter and mine inventory can become a guerrilla raider. Chief O'Brien, who'd modified the Defiant's transporters for this new role, nodded. The beauty of it is, the Imperials can't defend against it. Their shields stop energy weapons and torpedoes, but transporters work on different principles. We can beam explosives directly into their ships, onto their bridges, into their reactor cores. Dr. Bashir, the only one who looked uncomfortable, spoke quietly. We're talking about remote assassination, beaming bombs onto ships and killing crews who never see us coming. That's not warfare, it's terrorism. It's survival, Sisko corrected. The Imperials have the advantage in every conventional engagement. Bigger ships, better shields, more firepower. If we fight them the way they want to fight, we lose. So we don't fight fair. We hit them where they're weak, when they're vulnerable, and we don't give them a chance to respond. It's still a violation of what, Doctor? The rules of war. The Imperials burned Vulcan and murdered 6 billion people. They don't recognize our laws, our conventions, or our moral standards. If we're going to beat them, we have to fight the war they've given us, not the war we wish we were fighting. Bashir fell silent, but his expression remained troubled. Sisko understood the doctor still believed in the Federation's ideals, still thought they could wage war without becoming monsters. 3 months ago, Sisko had believed the same thing. Now he knew better. Across Federation space, dozens of other ships were adopting similar tactics. The USS Enterprise had become a ghost ship, appearing without warning to destroy Imperial installations and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. The USS Voyager, recently returned from the Delta Quadrant with advanced technology, used its ablative armor and transphasic torpedoes to devastating effect. Even civilian ships were being armed and trained for hit-and-run attacks. On the former colony world of Terelia, Federation resistance cells were learning a different kind of warfare. The planet had fallen to Imperial occupation 3 weeks earlier, its defenders overwhelmed by orbital bombardment and massed Imperial Guard assaults. 10,000 guardsmen now occupied the major settlements, enforcing Imperial law with brutal efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen crouched in the ruins of what had been Tyrelia's capital city and watched the Imperial patrol through her rifle scope. 6 guardsmen in full combat armor, moving in disciplined formation through streets where civilians once walked freely. Now the civilians hid indoors, terrified of the occupiers who executed anyone who showed insufficient deference to their Emperor God. Chen's resistance cell numbered 23 people, Starfleet officers who'd been stranded when the planet fell, local militia volunteers, and a handful of civilians with nothing left to lose. They had limited weapons, no support, and were facing an enemy that controlled the planet from orbit. By any rational calculation, they should surrender. Instead, they fought. "Target the rear guard," Chen whispered into her communicator. "On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark." Phaser fire lanced from 3 different positions simultaneously. The rear 2 guardsmen went down, their armor overwhelmed by concentrated fire. The remaining 4 dove for cover, returning fire with their lasguns. Beams of coherent light scorched the rubble where Chen's people had been, but they were already moving, using the ruins' complex terrain to their advantage. Chen triggered a proximity mine she'd planted the night before. The explosion caught 2 more guardsmen, the blast channeled by the narrow street into a kill zone. The surviving 2 tried to retreat but ran straight into another ambush, a civilian woman who'd lost her family to Imperial brutality, now armed with a disruptor and absolutely nothing to lose. She fired point blank before being cut down by lasgun fire. 5 seconds later, Chen put a phaser bolt through the last guardsman's helmet. The street fell silent, except for the crackle of flames and the moans of the dying. "Grab their weapons," Chen ordered. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before reinforcements arrive." Her team moved with practiced efficiency, stripping the dead guardsmen of lasguns, power packs, and grenades. They'd learned that Imperial weapons, while crude by Federation standards, were durable and effective. More importantly, they didn't require Federation power cells, which were increasingly scarce. They disappeared into the ruins, just as a Valkyrie gunship roared overhead, searchlights cutting through the smoke. Chen and her team sheltered in a collapsed basement, breathing hard, listening to the Imperials search for them. They found nothing. The Resistance had learned to be ghosts striking without warning and vanishing before retaliation could come. In the command bunker 3 miles away, Commissar Volker Steiner listened to the report of yet another ambush with growing fury. In 3 weeks, his garrison had suffered 200 casualties to an enemy they rarely saw. Every patrol was at risk. Every street could hide insurgents. The locals provided no intelligence, either out of loyalty to the Federation or terror of reprisal. "Increase security patrols," he ordered. "Institute random searches of civilian shelters. Execute 10 civilians for every guardsman killed. His aide, a young lieutenant who still possessed some remnants of conscience, hesitated. Sir, that will only create more insurgents. If we execute civilians, then they will learn the cost of harboring terrorists. Steiner snapped. The Emperor's mercy is not weakness. It is death, swift rather than slow. These Zeno's lovers will submit or they will die. There is no third option. The executions began that afternoon. Imperial guardsmen dragged civilians from their homes at random, lined them up in the central square, and shot them. Men, women, elderly, even children, the Imperials made no distinctions. For every guardsman killed, 10 civilians died. The math was simple and horrifying. Chen watched through binoculars from a kilometer away, her hands white-knuckled on the device. She was watching people die because of her resistance, because of her choice to fight rather than submit. Every bullet fired at Imperial soldiers was paid for in civilian blood. We have to stop, one of her team members said, a young ensign named Parks. They're killing innocents because of us. They were killing innocents before we started fighting back, Chen replied, her voice hard. The Imperials don't need reasons for their brutality. If we stop, they'll just find other excuses. At least this way, we're making them pay a price for occupation. By getting our own people killed, by showing the Imperials that conquest isn't free, by making them bleed for every street, every building, every day they stay here. She lowered her binoculars. I know it's ugly. I know it costs lives. But if we surrender, everyone dies anyway. At least this way we're fighting. It was the logic of insurgency, brutal and inescapable. The strong could afford mercy. The weak survived through making occupation unbearable. The Federation, facing extinction, had learned to be weak in ways that cut deeper than any fleet engagement. Across Imperial-occupied space, resistance cells fought similar battles. On Deneb IV, Federation operatives sabotaged Imperial supply depots, destroying ammunition and equipment. On Cestus III, miners turned their industrial equipment into improvised weapons and ambushed Imperial patrols in the colony's vast tunnel networks. On Rigel VII, local insurgents used their knowledge of the planet's treacherous geography to lure Imperial forces into kill zones. The Imperials responded with escalating brutality. For every ambush, they executed hostages. For every sabotaged depot, they burned a settlement. For every dead guardsman, they killed 10 civilians. But the resistance continued, because surrender meant slow extermination while fighting meant at least some could survive. On the bridge of the Emperor's Wrath, rogue trader Harlock studied the casualty reports with growing concern. 3 months of occupation, and his forces had suffered nearly 8,000 dead from guerrilla attacks. Not catastrophic losses by Imperial standards, but unsustainable if the trend continued. More troubling were the supply issues, convoys being ambushed, depots being destroyed, logistics chains disrupted by an enemy that refused to stand and fight. The Xenos fight like cowards, Commissar Steiner reported via Vox. They strike from shadows and flee before we can bring proper force to bear. They hide among civilians and use terrain to negate our advantages. They fight like insurgents, Harlock corrected, which means we're no longer conducting a crusade, we're managing an occupation. And occupations consume resources without providing victory. He studied the strategic map, showing Imperial-controlled space marked in red. So much territory taken, but none of it secured. We need to change tactics. Pull back from the outer colonies and consolidate around strategic objectives. Let the Federation have their worthless rocks if they want them. Retreat. Steiner's voice was sharp with outrage even through the Vox static. We serve the God Emperor. We do not retreat from Xenos filth. We're not retreating, Commissar. We're consolidating. There's a difference. Harlock zoomed the map to show Federation core worlds. The enemy has adapted to our conventional tactics. They're avoiding fleet engagements and focusing on asymmetric warfare, so we adapt in turn. We identify critical infrastructure shipyards, supply hubs, major population centers, and we hit them so hard that the Federation has to respond conventionally or watch their capacity to wage war evaporate. You propose targeting their industrial capacity? I propose we make them choose between protecting their civilians and protecting their ability to fight. Force them into battles they can't win through guerrilla tactics. Harlock's augmetic eye glowed in the bridge's dim light. The Federation thinks they've found a way to hurt us without exposing themselves to our strength. Time to remind them that asymmetric warfare cuts both ways. The new Imperial strategy manifested within days. Rather than trying to hold vast territories, Imperial forces withdrew to fortified positions around key objectives and launched deep strike raids into Federation space. Their targets weren't military installations but civilian infrastructure, power stations, water treatment facilities, food production centers. On Andoria, an Imperial strike force hit the planet's geothermal plants, crippling heating systems just as winter descended on the ice world's inhabited regions. Thousands died from exposure before emergency systems could be activated. On Teller, Imperial raiders destroyed agricultural processing centers, creating food shortages that would take months to resolve. On Deneb, they poisoned water supplies with chemical weapons that made entire river systems unusable. The Federation faced a terrible choice: pull forces back to defend civilian infrastructure, or maintain the guerrilla campaign and watch their populations suffer. There was no good answer, only different flavors of catastrophe. In Starfleet Command, Admiral Ross convened an emergency meeting with senior commanders and intelligence operatives, working through unofficial channels. The assessment was delivered with characteristic bluntness. The Imperials have figured out our strategy and countered it. They're not trying to hold territory anymore, they're trying to collapse our capacity to support a war effort. Every power plant they destroy, every food production center they hit, creates civilian casualties and resource shortages that force us to divert military assets to disaster relief. So we're losing the guerrilla war? Admiral Nikhaev demanded. We're losing the strategic game, came the reply. Tactically, our raids are still effective. We're killing Imperials, disrupting their supply lines, making occupation costly. But strategically, they're forcing us to choose between military operations and civilian survival. Picard, attending via hologram from the Enterprise, spoke quietly. There may be another option. The Imperials depend on their ability to navigate. They use some kind of specialized psychers called navigators to travel through their version of warp space. Intelligence suggests these individuals are rare and irreplaceable. If we could target them systematically. Assassination, Worf said bluntly. Kill their navigators, strand their fleets. It's a war crime, Picard said. Targeting non-combatants specifically for assassination violates every convention of Manus. Captain, the voice interrupted. With respect, we're 3 months past worrying about conventions. The Imperials have no combatant, non-combatant distinction. They kill everyone. If their navigators are a strategic vulnerability, we exploit it. That's how you win wars. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood what was being proposed. Targeted assassination of civilians whose only crime was possessing a genetic mutation that made them useful to the Imperial war machine. It was morally indefensible and strategically necessary, the kind of choice that defined this war. I'll authorize a pilot program, Ross said finally. Operations will be coordinated through appropriate channels. Enterprise and Voyager will take point. Identify Imperial navigators and eliminate them. Quietly if possible, dramatically if necessary. The goal is to disrupt their fleet movements and isolate their forces. Picard's hologram flickered with what might have been resignation. Understood, Admiral. The assassination campaign began within a week. Using intelligence gathered from captured Imperial personnel and signals analysis, the distinct energy signatures of navigator chambers on Imperial ships were identified. The navigators themselves were psychers of immense power, capable of perceiving the warp and guiding ships through its currents. In this strange dimension where the Astronomican's light didn't reach, they were struggling to navigate effectively even with their abilities. They were also rare, irreplaceable, and absolutely critical to what remained of Imperial operations. The Enterprise's first target was an Imperial cruiser conducting a supply run through Federation space. Data identified the navigator chamber through its unique energy profile, heavily shielded, radiating psychic emanations that the android's positronic brain could detect, even if he couldn't fully interpret them. Transporter lock established, O'Brien reported. He was on temporary assignment to the Enterprise, his expertise in transporter technology making him invaluable for this kind of operation. Navigator chamber located. Ready to transport package. The package was a proximity mine with a transporter beacon attached. 1 second it sat in the Enterprise's transporter buffer. The next second it materialized inside the Imperial cruiser's navigator chamber, a sacred space deep within the ship where a mutant human with 3 eyes guided the vessel through impossible dimensions. The mine detonated. The navigator, a woman who'd served the Imperium for 60 years, died instantly along with her attendants and servitors. Without her, the cruiser was blind, unable to make effective warp jumps, effectively stranded in real space light years from support. Target destroyed, data reported. The cruiser is adrift. They're attempting to signal for assistance. Jam their communications, Picard ordered. Let them sit there. Maybe someone will rescue them. Maybe they won't. Either way, that's one more ship out of the war. Over the next month, coordinated strikes occurred across Imperial-controlled space. Navigators died by the dozens, assassinated through remote weapons delivered via transporter, their deaths invisible to their crews until it was too late. Imperial fleet movements became erratic as ships without navigators were stranded or forced to travel using only short, dangerous warp jumps calculated by cogitators, a desperate measure that often resulted in ships emerging thousands of light years off course, or not emerging at all. But the Imperials adapted. They began shielding navigator chambers with null fields that disrupted transporters. They grouped ships together so that stranded vessels could be towed. And they retaliated by targeting Federation civilians with even greater brutality, executing thousands in reprisal for each murdered navigator. The war became a nightmare spiral of escalation. The Federation fought like insurgents, and the Imperials responded by making civilian populations pay the price. Every victory the Federation won came at a cost measured in thousands of innocent dead. On Deep Space Nine, now operating as a heavily armed fortress in Federation space, Sisko received reports of the latest Imperial reprisal. On Barolia 2, a Federation colony that had surrendered to Imperial occupation, the Guardsmen had executed 40,000 civilians in response to a navigator assassination nearby. Men, women, children lined up and shot in mass graves that stretched for miles. 40,000, Sisko said quietly, staring at the casualty figures. We killed one navigator, and they murdered 40,000 people. Major Kira, hardened by years of resistance against the Cardassians, looked ill. Benjamin, we can't keep doing this. Every operation we conduct gets more civilians killed, and if we stop operating, the Imperials win, and everyone dies anyway, Sisko countered. You fought the Cardassians. You know how this works. Occupation requires brutality, and brutality creates resistance, and resistance creates more brutality. It's an endless cycle that only ends when one side gives up or bleeds out. The Cardassians were rational actors, Kira said. Brutal, yes, but they wanted something: resources, territory, strategic advantage. These Imperials want extermination. They're not trying to make us submit. They're trying to make us extinct while using maximum cruelty in the process. Then we make extinction as costly as possible. We make every day of occupation a nightmare for them. We make them pay in blood and resources for every system they hold. Eventually, they'll decide we're not worth the cost and pull back, or they'll just keep killing until there's no one left to resist. Sisko had no answer to that, because it was entirely possible. The Imperials had proven themselves capable of genocidal brutality, and they showed no signs of wavering in their religious conviction that aliens deserved death. The Federation was fighting for survival against an enemy that viewed survival itself as heresy. On the surface of Tyrelia, Lieutenant Commander Chen's resistance cell had grown to 43 members. They'd learned the rhythm of occupation when patrols moved, where security was weakest, how to strike and vanish. In 2 months, they'd killed over 300 Imperials and destroyed significant amounts of equipment. They'd also watched as the Imperials executed 2,000 civilians in reprisal. Chen carried each of those deaths like stones in her chest, weight that never lessened no matter how many times she told herself it was necessary. Tonight, they were planning their most ambitious operation yet, hitting the Imperial garrison's command center. Intelligence suggested Commissar Steiner would be present, and killing him might disrupt Imperial operations across the entire sector. It was exactly the kind of high-value target that could justify the risks. Or it was a suicide mission that would get them all killed and accomplish nothing. "We go in at 0300 hours, Chen briefed her team. "Diversionary attack on the eastern perimeter draws their quick reaction force away. Main team uses the underground storm drains to approach the command center. Demolitions charges placed at structural weak points. We blow it, we extract, we disappear. And if we get caught?" Parks asked. "We don't get caught. Because if we do, they'll torture us for information and then execute us slowly as an example, so we don't get caught." The operation launched according to plan. The diversionary attack pulled Imperial forces east, just as predicted. Chen's team infiltrated through the storm drains, bypassing security checkpoints and patrol routes. They placed their charges with practiced efficiency, linked detonators, set timers. That's when everything went wrong. Commissar Steiner had anticipated the attack. He'd noticed the pattern of resistance operations always striking where security was weakest, always using terrain to advantage, always timing attacks to exploit predictable patrol schedules. So he'd changed the pattern, reinforced unexpected approaches, and waited. When Chen's team emerged from the storm drains, they found themselves surrounded by 2 platoons of Imperial guardsmen with heavy weapons. Las fire cut through the darkness, catching 3 resistance fighters before they could react. Chen dove for cover, returning fire with her modified phaser rifle, but they were pinned down with no escape route. "Fall back!" she screamed. "Back to the drains!" But the Imperials had blocked the exits. Chen watched her team die around her. Parks took a lasgun burst to the chest, his body tumbling backward into the darkness. Martinez was hit by a grenade, her screams cutting off abruptly. Williams fought hand-to-hand with a guardsman twice his size and was beaten to death with a rifle butt. Chen fought until her weapon's power cell was empty, then fought with a knife, then fought with her bare hands. When they finally subdued her, she'd killed 4 more guardsmen and wounded 6 others. Commissar Steiner observed her capture with cold satisfaction. "Chain her in the central square," he ordered. "I want every civilian in the city to witness what happens to terrorists who defy the Emperor's peace." They chained Chen to a post in broad daylight and left her there for 3 days. No food, no water. Exposed to the elements and the stares of civilians who'd lost family members to Imperial reprisals and blamed the resistance for their suffering. Some looked at her with pity. Others spat at her feet. Most just looked away, too broken by occupation to care. On the 3rd day, Steiner had her brought before him. She could barely stand, her body wrecked by exposure and dehydration, but she met his eyes with defiance. "You fought well," the commissar said. "For a Xenos lover. Your team killed over 300 of the Emperor's faithful. That requires acknowledgement." "Go to hell," Chen rasped. "I am offering you a choice. Reveal the locations of other resistance cells, and you will die quickly. Refuse, and you will die very, very slowly while your fellow terrorists watch. Either way serves the Emperor's purposes, but one is measurably less unpleasant for you." Chen spat blood at his feet. "I've got nothing to say to religious fanatics who murder civilians and call it righteousness." Steiner nodded, as if he'd expected that response. "Admirable loyalty to a doomed cause. Very well. Take her to the fabrication center. The servitor conversion process will be educational for the locals." They dragged Chen away, screaming. The servitor conversion process was something from nightmares: lobotomy, cybernetic augmentation, personality erasure. The Imperials turned living beings into programmable machines, slaves without will or identity. Chen fought every step, but there were too many of them, and she was too weak. The last coherent thought Sarah Chen ever had was a bitter hope that her sacrifice had been worth something, that the resistance would continue, that the Federation would survive. Then the tech priests began their work, and Sarah Chen ceased to exist. What remained was Servitor Unit 447 Delta, a mindless automaton programmed to perform simple labor tasks until its biological components failed. Commissar Steiner had the servitor that had been Chen placed in the central square as a warning. The message was clear: resist the Imperium and lose not just your life but your very humanity. For 3 weeks, The former Lieutenant Commander Chen performed menial tasks in full view of the city's survivors, a walking reminder of the cost of defiance. The resistance on Terelia continued anyway, because the alternative to fighting was slow death under occupation, and at least fighting meant dying on your feet rather than your knees. The humans of the Federation had learned something the Imperials never expected, that when pushed hard enough, when facing extinction, even the most peaceful civilization would embrace guerrilla warfare's brutal logic. The war was 3 months old. The Federation had lost worlds, ships, millions of lives. They'd abandoned their principles, committed war crimes, and embraced tactics that would have horrified them a year earlier. But they were still fighting, still resisting, still making the Imperials pay for every kilometer of occupied space. It wasn't victory, but it was survival. And in this war, survival was all that mattered. The laboratory deep beneath Utopia Planitia on Mars hummed with activity that would have been illegal 4 months ago. Dr. Leah Brahms stood before a holographic display showing the molecular structure of Imperial void shield technology, her eyes bloodshot from 72 hours of continuous work. Around her, 24 of Starfleet's best engineers worked in shifts, analyzing wreckage recovered from destroyed Imperial vessels, testing theories, failing, and testing again. "Run the simulation one more time," Brahms ordered, her voice hoarse. "Modulate the phaser frequency to match the shield's harmonic oscillation. If we can create a resonance cascade," the simulation played out on the screen. A phaser beam struck an Imperial void shield, and instead of being absorbed or deflected, it caused the shield to fluctuate wildly. The fluctuation lasted only 2.3 seconds before the shield compensated, but for those brief moments, the shield's protective capability dropped by 60%. "That's it," Brahms whispered. "That's how we hurt them." Commander Geordie LaForge, standing beside her, studied the data with his visor's enhanced vision. "The window is too small. By the time our weapons officers recognize the shield fluctuation and adjust targeting, the shields will have compensated. We need faster reaction times than human reflexes can provide." "Then we don't use human reflexes." Brahms pulled up another schematic. "We program the tactical computers to automatically adjust phaser frequencies in real time, constantly searching for resonance patterns. The instant a void shield shows harmonic vulnerability, our weapons exploit it before the Imperials can compensate. Automated targeting systems are prohibited under Federation regulations that don't apply anymore," Brahms interrupted. "We suspended those rules 3 months ago. The Imperials are killing us because their technology is superior. If we can level the playing field even slightly, we take it." Admiral Ross approved any and all research that gives us an edge. LaForge nodded slowly. He'd spent weeks on the Enterprise watching Picard struggle with the moral compromises this war demanded. Now here was another one, automated weapons systems that removed human judgment from the kill decision. But the alternative was continuing to fight with weapons that barely scratched Imperial shields while Imperial weapons tore through Federation defenses like tissue paper. "How long to implement fleet-wide?" LaForge asked. 2 weeks if we push hard. Every ship will need its tactical systems upgraded, weapons recalibrated, computer cores reprogrammed. But after that, we'll have weapons that can actually damage Imperial vessels." Brahms managed a grim smile. "They'll still outgun us 10-1, but at least we'll be able to make them bleed." The modifications rolled out across the fleet with desperate speed. Every starship underwent tactical upgrades. Their computers programmed with new algorithms that constantly analyzed void shield harmonics and adjusted weapons frequencies to exploit momentary vulnerabilities. It wasn't a silver bullet. Imperial shields still provided formidable protection, but it transformed Starfleet weapons from completely ineffective to occasionally deadly. The first test came 2 weeks later, when the USS Titan encountered an Imperial destroyer on patrol near the neutral zone. Captain William Riker watched the tactical display as his ship closed to weapons range, knowing this engagement would prove whether months of research had been worth the cost. "Target locked," reported Lieutenant Serial Rager from Tactical. "New targeting system is active and tracking void shield harmonics." "Fire at will," Riker ordered. The Titan's phasers lanced out, but unlike previous engagements, they didn't simply splash harmlessly against Imperial shields. The tactical computer detected a harmonic vulnerability in the Void Shield's forward arc and automatically adjusted the phaser frequency. For 2.1 seconds, the shields destabilized. Quantum torpedoes followed the phaser strikes, punching through the weakened shields and impacting the destroyer's armored hull. The Imperial ship shuddered under the impact. Armor plating buckled. Secondary explosions rippled across its superstructure. It wasn't destroyed, the vessel was simply too massive and too well armored to go down from one salvo, but it was damaged. Actually, visibly damaged. "Direct hit," Rager reported, her voice filled with shocked excitement. "We penetrated their shields." Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12. Their reactor output is fluctuating. Riker allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before reality reasserted itself. They're returning fire. Evasive maneuvers. The Imperial destroyer's lance batteries spoke with fury. The Titan's shields held for 3 seconds before collapsing, but those 3 seconds gave the helmsman time to dodge. The lance strike that would have vaporized the ship's engineering section instead carved off the port nacelle. Crippled but alive, the Titan limped away at impulse, while the damaged destroyer couldn't pursue at full speed. It wasn't a clean victory, but it was a victory. For the first time since the war began, a Federation ship had engaged an Imperial vessel one-on-one and lived to tell about it. Word of the engagement spread through Starfleet like wildfire. The Imperials could be hurt, their shields could be penetrated, their ships could be damaged. After months of helpless defeat, the Federation finally had a weapon that worked. But Starfleet Command understood the strategic reality. Even with improved weapons, the Federation couldn't win through conventional fleet engagements. The Imperials still had too many ships, too much firepower, too much armor. What the new technology offered was the possibility of inflicting real casualties in guerrilla operations, hitting hard enough to make Imperial commanders think twice about deep strikes into Federation space. The second breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Aboard Deep Space Nine, Constable Odo made a discovery that would change the course of the war. The changeling had been interrogating an Imperial prisoner, a junior officer captured when his transport was disabled during a resistance ambush. The interrogation had been unpleasant but necessary, employing techniques that would have horrified the old Federation. The prisoner, a man named Corvus, had been chemically conditioned to resist torture and indoctrinated since childhood to view aliens as abominations worthy only of death. But Odo noticed something during the interrogation. When discussing the Imperial fleet's movements, Corvus mentioned the navigators with a mixture of reverence and fear. These psychers were essential to warp travel, yes, but they were also fragile, unstable, prone to madness. And they were irreplaceable on a tactical timeline. "How many navigators does your fleet have?" Odo asked. Corvus, his mind deteriorating under chemical interrogation, answered without thinking. "Maybe 40? 50? Lord Harlock brought 3 with his flagship, others on the cruisers. Not enough. Never enough. Navigators die, and we wait months for replacements from the Imperium. And without the Astronomican's light." He trailed off, his expression haunted. "We're blind here. The cogitators can calculate short jumps, but anything beyond a few light years risks catastrophic misjump. The navigators are all that keep us from being completely stranded." Odo reported this to Commander Sisko immediately. "Benjamin, if the Imperials only have 40 or 50 navigators for their entire fleet, if they're already struggling with navigation in our space, and it takes months to get replacements, then navigators are a critical vulnerability," Sisko finished. "We've been assassinating them, but we haven't been systematic about it. If we coordinate fleet-wide, target every navigator we can identify simultaneously, we could cripple their fleet mobility in a single operation. It was the kind of war crime that would have been unthinkable before Vulcan burned. Coordinated assassination of non-combatants, targeting individuals whose only crime was possessing a genetic mutation. But the Federation had learned to think in terms of strategic vulnerabilities rather than moral absolutes. Through carefully compartmentalized channels, the operation was coordinated with clinical efficiency. Every ship in the fleet received targeting data on Imperial vessels known or suspected to carry navigators. The attack was scheduled for a 48-hour window, timed to hit as many targets as possible before the Imperials could respond. The USS Enterprise drew one of the most critical targets, the Emperor's Wrath itself, rogue trader Harlock's flagship. Data had identified 3 separate navigator chambers aboard the massive vessel, each one shielded and protected but vulnerable to transporter-delivered munitions if they could get close enough. "This is unconscionable," Picard said quietly, standing in his ready room with Data and Worf. "We're planning the assassination of 3 individuals who have likely never fired a weapon, never harmed anyone directly. They're simply trying to do their jobs. Their jobs enable genocide," Worf countered. "Without navigators, the Imperial fleet cannot operate effectively. They become scattered, isolated, vulnerable. Tactically, this operation could save millions of lives. At the cost of how many more pieces of our souls?" Picard looked at Data. "You've run the simulations. What are the probabilities of success?" The android's yellow eyes were impassive. "If the coordinated strikes achieve even 70% effectiveness, Imperial fleet mobility will be reduced by an estimated 60 to 80%. Ships without navigators will be effectively stranded, unable to make safe long-distance warp jumps, forced to travel at sublight speeds, or attempt dangerous short jumps that may strand them further. This would effectively neutralize significant portions of their military capability. And the moral calculation? I am an android, Captain. I can calculate tactical probabilities but not moral absolutes. That judgment must be yours." Picard turned to stare out his viewport at the stars. 4 months ago, he would have refused this mission categorically, would have argued passionately that the Federation must maintain its principles even in the face of extinction. Now, after New Montana, after watching colonies burn and ships die, after making compromise after compromise in the name of survival, he found himself with nothing left to sacrifice except the mission itself. "Prepare the operation," he said finally. "We'll target the Emperor's Wrath during its patrol through the Calandra sector. Cloaked approach, transporter assault on all 3 navigator chambers simultaneously. If we succeed, Harlock's flagship becomes a drifting monument to his hubris." The Enterprise stalked the Emperor's Wrath for 3 days, cloaked and patient, waiting for the perfect moment. Picard watched the massive Imperial vessel with something approaching hatred. That ship had led the assault on Vulcan. Its weapons had killed 6 billion innocents. Its captain had ordered atrocities across a dozen worlds. "We're in optimal position," reported Lieutenant Daniels from Tactical. "Navigator chambers identified and locked. Transporter packages ready." "Captain," Data said quietly, "I am detecting 3 distinct psychic signatures within the navigator chambers. The individuals are aware of something. Their psychic emanations are increasing in intensity. Can they detect us through the cloak? Unknown. However, their agitation suggests they sense danger even if they cannot identify its source." Picard felt a chill. The navigators knew they were about to die. Somehow, through whatever sixth sense allowed them to perceive the warp, they felt death approaching, and there was nothing they could do about it. "Execute the operation," Picard ordered. The Enterprise's transporters hummed. 3 packages materialized simultaneously in 3 separate navigator chambers aboard the Emperor's Wrath. Proximity mines, set for immediate detonation, appearing in shielded spaces where psychers guided the ship through impossible dimensions. The mines exploded. Aboard the Emperor's Wrath, Navigator Sibyl Arentius was attempting to calculate a safe warp route through this dimension's strange currents when she felt death arrive. Her third eye, the mutant organ that allowed her to perceive the warp, showed her a glimpse of something terrible materializing in her chamber. She had 1 second to scream a warning before the mine detonated, vaporizing her, her attendants, and destroying the sacred instruments that had guided House Harlock's vessels for 3 centuries. The other 2 navigators died similarly, their chambers torn apart by explosives that appeared without warning. In 15 seconds, the Emperor's Wrath lost its ability to make safe warp jumps. The massive flagship, capable of crossing light years and hours through careful warp travel, was now limited to dangerous short jumps or sublight speeds that would take decades to reach even nearby star systems. On the bridge, rogue trader Harlock felt the ship shudder as the navigator chambers exploded. Alarms shrieked. Servitors chattered in binary panic. His command crew scrambled to assess the damage. while he stood frozen, understanding immediately what had happened. "The navigators," he said quietly. "They're dead, all three." Commissar Steiner, standing at his customary position, went pale beneath his peaked cap. "How?" "The chambers are shielded, protected by blessed wards. It doesn't matter how. What matters is we're blind. This ship cannot make safe warp jumps without navigators. We can attempt short, calculated jumps, but in this cursed dimension." Harlock activated the Vox network. "All ships, report navigator status immediately." The responses came in over the next hour, each one worse than the last. Across the Imperial fleet, navigator chambers had been hit by synchronized attacks. Of the 47 navigators that had accompanied the crusade into Federation space, 31 were confirmed dead. 16 survived, but they were scattered across different vessels, insufficient to guide the entire fleet safely. The strategic implications were catastrophic. Without navigators, most of the Imperial fleet was trapped, unable to maneuver strategically, unable to concentrate forces, unable to respond to threats with any confidence. Ships could still fight, but they couldn't move between star systems faster than light without risking catastrophic misjumps that might strand them light years from their intended destination. "We've been crippled," Harlock admitted, his augmetic eye flickering with barely suppressed fury. "The Xenos have learned to target our most critical vulnerability, and we walked right into it." And the coordinated navigator assassinations achieved 73% effectiveness, better than the most optimistic projections. Within 48 hours, the Imperial fleet's strategic mobility collapsed. Ships that had been terrorizing Federation space found themselves isolated, unable to coordinate with other Imperial forces, forced to rely on risky calculated jumps or sublight drives that made them vulnerable to ambush. Starfleet Command didn't waste the opportunity. With Imperial ships scattered and effectively immobile, Federation forces launched a series of coordinated strikes designed to destroy isolated vessels before they could be rescued or regain safe warp capability. The USS Voyager, equipped with transphasic torpedoes and ablative armor from its Delta Quadrant journey, hunted down 3 stranded Imperial destroyers in the Mutara sector. Captain Janeway showed no mercy, using her technological advantages to annihilate ships that couldn't run and couldn't effectively fight back. 9,000 Imperial personnel died in those engagements, and Janeway felt nothing except grim satisfaction that the butchers who'd destroyed Vulcan were finally paying a price. But the true test of the Federation's new capabilities would come at Earth itself. Rogue trader Harlock, stranded aboard his immobilized flagship, had made a calculated decision. If the Emperor's wrath couldn't move strategically, he would use it tactically. He ordered the ship to make a slow, sublight advance toward the Sol system, a journey that would take weeks, but would culminate in an assault on the Federation's heart. Other Imperial ships with surviving navigators were ordered to converge on Earth through carefully calculated short warp jumps, creating a fleet that would either capture humanity's homeworld or destroy it trying. Starfleet Command saw the Imperial fleet's approach and made their own calculation. This was the battle that would determine everything. If Earth fell, the Federation died. If Earth held, the Imperials might finally be convinced that conquest was too costly to continue. Every available ship was recalled to Sol. The Enterprise, the Defiant, Voyager, the Titan, ships from the Klingon Empire and Romulan Star Empire that had finally been convinced the Imperial threat was existential. Over 300 vessels gathered in Earth's defense, the largest fleet the Federation had ever assembled. Against them came 47 Imperial ships, including the Emperor's Wrath. By pure tonnage and firepower, the Imperials still held a massive advantage. But the Federation had home-ground defensive positions, the new shield-penetrating weapons, and a desperation born of knowing there was nowhere left to retreat. The battle began at the edge of the Sol system as Imperial ships dropped out of short warp jumps near Neptune's orbit, some arriving on target, others emerging millions of kilometers off course, testament to the difficulty of navigating without the Astronomicon. The Emperor's Wrath, traveling at sublight speeds, was still days away, but the ships that had successfully made the jump began the assault. Admiral Ross, commanding from Earth Space Dock, watched the tactical displays and gave the order that would define the battle. All ships engage at will. Primary targets are Imperial capital ships. Secondary targets are escort vessels. Use the new targeting systems, find the shield harmonics and exploit them. Make every shot count. The Federation fleet surged forward in a coordinated assault pattern that would have been suicide 4 months ago. But now, equipped with weapons that could actually penetrate void shields, they had a chance. The USS Enterprise led a squadron of 12 ships against an Imperial battlecruiser, its lances already firing at long range. Picard's tactical officer used the automated targeting systems to find the void shield's harmonic vulnerabilities. The moment a weakness appeared, every ship in the squadron concentrated fire on that exact point. The void shields flickered, destabilized, and collapsed. For 6 precious seconds, the Imperial battlecruiser was vulnerable. Quantum torpedoes, photon torpedoes, and concentrated phaser fire hammered its hull. Armor plating shattered. Secondary explosions rippled across its superstructure. The ship didn't die. Imperial vessels were simply too tough for that, but it was damaged, bleeding atmosphere and plasma, its weapons reduced to 50% effectiveness. Target their engine sections, Picard ordered. Disable them. The squadron concentrated fire on the battlecruiser's massive engine arrays. Another shield collapse, another devastating salvo. The engines exploded in a cascade of plasma venting, and the battlecruiser went dead in space, drifting and helpless. Across the battlefield, similar engagements played out. The Federation ships, fighting with coordination and weapons that finally worked, began inflicting real casualties. Not quickly, Imperial ships absorbed damage that would have destroyed Federation vessels 10 times over, but steadily, inexorably, the Imperial fleet started taking losses. The USS Defiant, small and deadly, dove into the heart of the Imperial formation and unleashed its pulse phasers at point-blank range. Cisco targeted an Imperial destroyer's bridge section, using transphasic torpedoes that phased through void shields without needing to wait for harmonic vulnerabilities. The destroyer's command center exploded, killing everyone inside. The ship didn't stop fighting. Imperial vessels had redundant command systems, but its coordination suffered, making it vulnerable to follow-up attacks. Captain Janeway, aboard Voyager, used her ship's ablative armor to tank damage that would cripple other vessels, closing to ranges where Imperial weapons were most effective, but so were hers. Her transphasic torpedoes were devastating at close range, each one punching through void shields and detonating inside Imperial hulls with catastrophic results. But the Imperials were still Imperials fanatics, who viewed death in service to the God Emperor as the highest honor. They fought with suicidal determination, ramming damaged ships into Federation vessels, setting reactors to overload to take enemies with them, continuing to fire even as their ships came apart around them. The battle raged for 6 hours. Ships exploded on both sides. The void lit up with lance fire and torpedo detonations. Debris fields spread across millions of kilometers. The casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. And slowly, inexorably, the Federation began to win. Not easily, not cleanly, but they were winning. For every Federation ship destroyed, they took down an Imperial vessel. The exchange ratio was nearly 1-to-1, which in conventional terms meant the Federation was still losing. The Imperials had better ships and could afford to trade. But psychologically, strategically, it was a victory. The Federation was proving it could fight back. When the Emperor's wrath finally arrived at the battlefield 3 days later, crawling in at sublight speeds, it found a scene of devastation. Of the 47 Imperial ships that had begun the assault, 23 had been destroyed and another 15 crippled. The surviving vessels clustered around Harlock's flagship, using it as a rally point. The Federation fleet, reduced to 180 operational ships, arrayed itself between the Imperial forces and Earth. They'd taken terrible casualties, over 100 ships destroyed, 30,000 personnel dead. But Earth still stood. The solar system remained in Federation hands. Admiral Ross opened a channel to all ships. They're going to make one final push. The Emperor's Wrath is the largest ship in their fleet, and it's coming straight for us. If we can destroy or disable that ship, the Imperials will break. Everything depends on this. Picard, standing on the Enterprise's battle-scarred bridge, looked at his crew. They were exhausted, running on stims in desperation. but they were still fighting. All squadrons, concentrate on the Emperor's wrath. Target its engines, weapons, anything that looks vulnerable. We end this, now. The Federation fleet launched its final assault. 180 ships, what remained of the defense force against the Emperor's wrath and its escorts. The massive Imperial flagship fired its lance batteries in all directions, each shot vaporizing or crippling Federation vessels. Its void shields, the most powerful in the fleet, absorbed impossible amounts of firepower. But the Federation had learned. Their automated targeting systems found the harmonics. Their weapons penetrated the shields. Slowly, meter by meter, they carved through the Emperor's wrath's defenses. Aboard the flagship, rogue trader Harlock watched his ship die around him. Fires raged through the lower decks. His weapons' batteries were being systematically destroyed. His shields were failing. Around him, his crew fought with fanatic determination, but it wasn't enough. Commissar Steiner stood beside him, bolt pistol drawn. We should attempt to withdraw, live to fight another day. With what navigators? Harlock asked bitterly. We're stranded here, Commissar. Our crusade ends in this system. He looked at the tactical displays, showing Earth a blue jewel still defiant, still unconquered. The Xenos learned to fight back. They adapted. Perhaps the God Emperor is testing us. Or perhaps, Steiner said quietly, we underestimated them. The final blow came from an unexpected source. Captain Picard, seeing the Emperor's wrath's shields fluctuating under sustained assault, made a decision that horrified every instinct he possessed. Prepare to ram, he ordered. Captain? Worf asked, thinking he'd misheard. We rammed them. Full impulse, directly into their bridge section. Our shields are failing anyway. We use the Enterprise as a weapon. Sir, that's a suicide run. Evacuate non-essential personnel to escape pods. Anyone who wants to leave, leaves now. The rest of us are finishing this. Across the Enterprise, escape pods launched as crew members made their choices. Some fled to safety, others stayed, unwilling to abandon their ship or their captain. Within minutes, the Enterprise's crew was reduced from 1,000 to 300 volunteers, who'd decided death was preferable to watching the Imperials win. The Enterprise surged forward at full impulse, directly toward the Emperor's Wrath's command section. Lance batteries fired, carving through the saucer section, but Picard kept the ship on course. Phasers firing continuously, torpedoes launching until the magazines were empty, the Enterprise closed the distance. At the last second, the Emperor's Wrath shields failed completely. The Enterprise, traveling at a significant fraction of light speed, impacted the Imperial flagship's bridge tower and punched through 15 decks before its warp core detonated. The explosion was visible from Earth, a new star burning briefly in the orbital space above the planet. The Emperor's Wrath, its command section obliterated and its reactor going critical, broke apart in a cascade of secondary explosions. Rogue trader Harlock, Commissar Steiner, and 8,000 Imperial personnel died in the blast. The remaining Imperial ships, leaderless and battered, retreated. They didn't surrender. The Imperium didn't recognize surrender, but they withdrew from Sol System at best possible speed, leaving their dead behind. Earth had held. The Federation had survived, but the cost had been devastating. 6 months after the ceasefire, the Federation was unrecognizable. Captain Benjamin Sisko stood in what had been the promenade of Deep Space Nine and surveyed the transformation with grim satisfaction. The station that had once been a bustling hub of commerce and culture was now a fortress. Weapons platforms bristled from every external pylon. Phaser banks lined corridors where shops once stood. The Bajoran Temple had been converted into a tactical command center. Civilian traffic was virtually non-existent. Only military personnel and essential support staff remained. This was the new Federation, militarized, paranoid, and brutally efficient. The new pulse cannons are online, reported Chief O'Brien, wiping grease from his hands. He looked older than his years, his face lined with stress and exhaustion. We can put out 3 times the firepower we had before the war. If the Imperials come back through that spatial rift, we'll be ready. If they come back, Sisko said quietly. Intelligence assessments suggest it's a matter of when, not if. Then we'd better be ready to hit them harder than they can imagine. O'Brien gestured to the tactical displays, showing the Bajoran sector. We've got automated defense platforms, minefield networks, and enough firepower to hold off a fleet twice the size of what attacked Earth. They want Bajor? They'll have to go through hell to get it. Sisko nodded, but he felt no satisfaction. They'd won the war technically. The Imperials had withdrawn as agreed, pulling their forces back through the dimensional rift and sealing it behind them with techniques the Federation still didn't fully understand. But victory felt hollow when measured against the cost. Vulcan remained a graveyard. 6 billion dead. Its cities still radioactive ruins, its survivors scattered across the Federation. Dozens of colony worlds had been burned or occupied, their populations exterminated or driven into refugee camps. The Federation's military had suffered catastrophic casualties, over 200 ships destroyed, nearly 100,000 personnel killed, and tens of thousands more wounded physically or psychologically, and the changes ran deeper than casualty figures. The Federation that emerged from the war was not the same civilization that had entered it. On Earth, in a secure facility beneath Starfleet Command, Admiral Ross convened a meeting of the new Strategic Defense Council. This was the replacement for the old Starfleet Command structure, a militarized hierarchy that operated with minimal civilian oversight and coordinated closely with intelligence operations that had expanded far beyond their pre-war scope. The briefing was delivered by analysts whose organizational affiliation went unmentioned, though everyone present understood they represented the intelligence apparatus that had become essential to the war effort. Gentlemen, ladies, we need to discuss the consolidation of occupied territories, the lead analyst began. The Imperials withdrew from 37 systems before leaving Federation space. Most of these worlds are devastated, infrastructure destroyed, populations reduced to remnants, governments collapsed. We need to establish military administration until stability can be restored. Admiral Nechayev studied the list of worlds. Military administration? You're talking about martial law. We're talking about survival. These worlds can't govern themselves right now. They need food, medicine, security, and rebuilding. The Federation Council is too slow, too bureaucratic to handle emergency relief on this scale. Military administration can act quickly and decisively. For how long? Demanded Admiral Paris, one of the few officers who still questioned the expanded security apparatus. How long before temporary military administration becomes permanent dictatorship? As long as necessary, came the reply without hesitation. The Federation faces existential threats we barely survived. The Imperials withdrew, but they'll be back. When they return, we need to be stronger, more unified, more capable of rapid response. That requires central authority, not endless debates in the Federation Council. Ross, who'd been listening silently, finally spoke. The Council has agreed to defer to military judgment on security matters. That was the political cost of surviving the war. We lost our innocence, Admiral Paris. We can mourn that loss later, after we've ensured there's a Federation left to mourn. The vote was formality. Military administration was authorized for all former Imperial-occupied territories, with intelligence oversight to ensure efficiency and security. The temporary measures would last at least 5 years, with extensions authorized as needed. Democracy in the Federation hadn't died in a single blow. It was dying gradually, strangled by emergency powers that never expired and security concerns that never diminished. On the rebuilt Enterprise F, commissioned 3 months after the Enterprise E's destruction, Captain Picard walked corridors that felt wrong. The new ship was more heavily armed than any Galaxy-class vessel should be. Its primary mission wasn't exploration but patrol and defense. The crew was younger, harder, all of them veterans of the Imperial War who'd learned to shoot first and ask questions never. Picard stood in his ready room, identical to his old one, yet fundamentally different, and stared at the model of his previous ship. The Enterprise E had died ramming an enemy vessel in a suicide attack. 217 crew had died with it. Picard had survived, pulled from an escape pod, and been given another ship because Starfleet needed experienced captains more than it needed justice. The door chimed. "Come." Counselor Troy entered, her expression troubled. "Captain, we have a situation. Security reports that Ensign Marcus has been detained for violating curfew protocols." Curfew protocols? Picard looked up sharply. Since when do we have curfew on a starship? Since last week. Security directive. All crew must be in quarters between 0100 and 0500 unless on duty. Marcus was in 10 forward at 0130, reading. Security arrested him. Picard felt rage building in his chest. This is absurd. We're Starfleet officers, not prisoners. Release Ensign Marcus immediately, and tell security that I will determine what protocols apply on my ship. Troy hesitated. Captain, the security directives supersede command discretion on certain matters. If you countermand them, you'll be flagged for review. Then flag me. I won't run a ship where officers are arrested for reading after midnight. He activated his comm badge. Picard to security. Release Ensign Marcus immediately. The curfew directive does not apply aboard the Enterprise. There was a pause, then a response. Sir, we'll need authorization from higher authority before. You'll need authorization from your captain, which I've just given you. Release him. Now, another pause. Aye, sir. After Troy left, Picard sat alone in his ready room and wondered what he was fighting for anymore. The Federation had survived the Imperial invasion, but at the cost of everything that made it worth defending. They'd become militarized, authoritarian, paranoid. The intelligence apparatus ran everything that mattered. Civil liberties were temporarily suspended. Dissenters were labeled security risks. They'd won the war against the Imperium, but they were losing the war for the Federation's soul. On Terelia, in the ruins of what had been Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen's resistance cell, survivors emerged from hiding to find their world transformed. The Imperials were gone, withdrawn as per the ceasefire agreement, but what they left behind was devastation. Cities were rubble, infrastructure was destroyed, millions were dead. The survivors faced starvation, disease, and the psychological trauma of 4 months under brutal occupation. Federation relief convoys arrived within days of the Imperial withdrawal, bringing food, medicine, and military administrators to restore order. But order came with conditions. Martial law was declared. Curfews were enforced. Anyone who'd collaborated with the Imperials, even under duress, was arrested and tried by military tribunal. The trials were quick, the sentences harsh. Hundreds were executed for treason. Marcus Webb, who'd been part of Chen's resistance cell, stood in the central square where Chen had been chained and watched Federation soldiers execute collaborators. He felt nothing. The people being shot had given information to the Imperials, helped them hunt resistance fighters, informed on neighbors who'd hidden refugees. They deserved death. But when the executions finished and the bodies were dragged away, Webb couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had broken. The Federation he'd believed in didn't execute prisoners without appeal, didn't impose martial law on its own citizens, didn't treat liberated worlds like occupied territories. We're becoming them, he said to Maria Santos, another resistance survivor. We're surviving, Santos corrected. The Imperials taught us that idealism gets you killed. The Federation learned that lesson. Now we do what's necessary, not what's noble. And when does necessary end? When do we go back to being the Federation? Santos looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. Maybe never. Maybe this is what we are now. Maybe the price of survival was everything we used to be. Webb had no response, because he suspected she was right. In the Calandra sector, near the sealed dimensional rift, a small Federation science station monitored the anomaly 24 hours a day. Dr. Patel, the lead researcher, had been studying the rift for 5 months, trying to understand how it worked and whether the Imperials could reopen it from their side. The spatial membrane is stable, she reported to Admiral Ross during their weekly briefing. Whatever technique the Imperials used to seal it, it's holding. We're detecting no transdimensional activity, no attempts at reopening from the other side. Could they be trying, and we're just not detecting it? Ross asked. It's possible. We're dealing with physics we barely understand. But based on what we can measure, the rift appears dormant. She pulled up sensor data showing the anomaly, a scar in space-time that pulsed with residual energy, but showed no sign of active use. However, that doesn't mean it's permanent. Everything we know about dimensional rifts suggests they want to reopen. It's possible the Imperials are simply waiting for the right moment. Your recommendation? Maintain constant monitoring. Deploy automated defense platforms around the rift. And continue researching dimensional mechanics so we're not caught off guard if they return. Patel paused. Admiral, there's something else. We're detecting quantum fluctuations that suggest the rift might not be the only connection between our universe and theirs. There could be other rifts, natural or artificial, that we haven't found yet. Ross felt his stomach drop. You're saying the Imperials might have multiple entry points into our space. I'm saying we can't be certain this is the only connection. The Imperials came through here, but their home dimension could connect to ours in dozens or hundreds of locations. We've only mapped a tiny fraction of the galaxy. There could be rifts anywhere. It was the nightmare scenario that kept the intelligence community awake at night. The Imperials might withdraw through one door while preparing to kick down a dozen others. The Federation could militarize, fortify, prepare, and still be blindsided by an attack from an unexpected direction. Expand the search, Ross ordered. I want every long-range sensor array looking for dimensional anomalies. If there are other rifts, we need to find them before the Imperials exploit them. On Earth, in a maximum security facility that didn't officially exist, the Federation held its most valuable asset, an Imperial prisoner who'd agreed to cooperate in exchange for his life. His name was Corvus, the junior officer Odo had interrogated months ago. The chemicals had damaged his mind, but he retained enough knowledge to be useful. An intelligence analyst sat across from Corvus in an interrogation room that was too bright, too cold, designed to keep prisoners uncomfortable without technically qualifying as torture. Tell me about the Imperium's reinforcement capabilities, the analyst said. How long before they can gather enough ships and navigators to mount another crusade into our space? Corvus, his eyes unfocused and his speech slurred, answered in the monotone of someone whose will had been broken. Years, maybe decades. The Imperium is vast, but it's also stretched thin. Millions of worlds, constant wars, endless threats. This sector, your Federation, would be classified as a minor frontier incident, not worth massive resource allocation unless strategic value increases. What would increase our strategic value? Proof of significant technology worth acquiring. Evidence of chaos, corruption that threatens nearby Imperial space. Or, Corvus's eyes focused briefly, showing a flash of his old personality. Or evidence that you're weak enough to be easily conquered. The Imperium respects strength. If you'd rolled over, they'd have sent overwhelming force to secure easy conquest. But you fought back, hurt them badly, made victory costly. That buys you time. How much time? 5 years? 10? 20? The Imperium moves slowly when not facing immediate crisis. They'll need to gather navigators, assemble a proper crusade fleet, get authorization from Sector Command, and they're fighting wars on 1,000 fronts against enemies far more dangerous than you. The analyst leaned back, processing this. So we have breathing room. You have a reprieve. Use it wisely. Because when they come back, they'll come prepared for what you did last time. They'll adapt, like you adapted. And they have 10,000 years of accumulated warfare knowledge to draw from. After the interrogation, the analyst stood alone in the observation room and contemplated the Federation's future. They had time, but time was a double-edged sword. Time to prepare, yes, but also time for the Federation's new militarized culture to calcify into permanent authoritarianism. Time for emergency powers to become normal. Time for the ideals that had defined the Federation to be forgotten entirely. The Federation had survived the Imperial invasion. But the question nobody was asking was whether the entity that survived was still the Federation at all, or something else wearing its name. On Bajor, in the rebuilt temple that had been reconsecrated after Imperial occupation, Vedic Burial stood before his congregation and spoke about faith in dark times. His flock had suffered terribly during the war. Bajor had been on the front lines, threatened repeatedly with orbital bombardment. The prophets had remained silent throughout, offering no guidance, no comfort, no intervention, though they had returned Cisco to linear existence when the threat became existential. The prophets test us, Burial said, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. They test our faith by withholding their presence. They test our values by forcing us to make impossible choices. And they test our souls by showing us what we become when pushed to our limits. In the congregation, Major Kira sat with her hands clenched. She'd fought the Cardassians for years, done terrible things in the name of Bajoran freedom. But even the Cardassian occupation hadn't broken her faith. The Imperial War had come close. Watching the Federation, the idealistic, principled Federation, descend into militaristic authoritarianism had shaken something fundamental in her worldview. The Federation saved us, Borrell continued. They fought the Imperials when they could have abandoned us. They sacrificed their ships and their people to protect worlds like ours. But in doing so, they changed. They became harder, colder, more ruthless. And now we must ask ourselves, did they change too much? Did they save our bodies while losing their souls? After the service, Kira approached Borrell privately. You're speaking dangerously. Security monitors everything, even religious services. Then let them monitor. I won't lie to my flock about what I see happening. Borrell looked at her with sad eyes. Neris, you fought the Cardassians. You know what occupation does to people, what brutality creates. The Federation is becoming what it fought against. Someone needs to say that before it's too late to change course. It might already be too late, Kira said quietly. The emergency powers were supposed to be temporary. It's been 6 months, and they're still in effect. The military administration of liberated worlds was supposed to last weeks. Now they're talking about years. Every day we don't roll back these changes, they become more permanent. Then we must resist. Not with violence. The Federation isn't the Cardassian Union, but with words, with conscience, with reminders of what they used to stand for. Borrell placed a hand on her shoulder. You've resisted occupation before. This is just a different kind of occupation, not by foreign invaders, but by fear and paranoia. It's still worth fighting. On the Enterprise F, Picard received a summons to Earth for a command review. He knew what it meant. He'd been flagged for his refusal to enforce certain security directives, and now he'd face consequences. The old Starfleet would have held hearings, allowed him to defend his decisions, respected command discretion. The new Starfleet operated differently. He materialized in a conference room at Starfleet Command to find Admiral Ross waiting, along with 2 other admirals and a representative from the intelligence community who declined to give his name. No formal hearing, no defense council, just an informal meeting that would determine his future. Captain Picard, Ross began carefully. You've countermanded security directives aboard the Enterprise. You've released crew members who'd been detained for protocol violations. There are concerns about your reliability in the current security environment. I exercised command authority over my own ship, Picard replied, keeping his voice level. Some of these directives are absurd, treating Starfleet officers like prisoners. I won't run a ship based on paranoia. The directives are designed to maintain operational security and crew readiness, the unnamed representative said. Your refusal to enforce them creates vulnerabilities. My crew is more vulnerable when they're treated with suspicion and subjected to arbitrary restrictions. Good order requires trust, not police state tactics. One of the admirals spoke up. Captain, the Federation is in a state of emergency. Perhaps not active combat, but we remain under threat. Security protocols exist for good reasons. The war ended 6 months ago with a ceasefire, Picard countered. We're not at war. We're using the threat of future war to justify continued erosion of the principles that define us. At what point do we acknowledge that the emergency is over and restore normal operations? The unnamed representative leaned forward. The emergency is over when we say it's over. Until then, you will comply with security directives, or you will be relieved of command. Your choice, Captain. Picard stood, meeting his eyes with cold fury. I've committed war crimes on orders from people like you. I've assassinated civilians, destroyed unarmed transports, and rammed my ship into an enemy vessel in a suicide attack that killed 200 of my crew. I've sacrificed every principle I held dear because I was convinced it was necessary for survival. But I won't sacrifice the last shred of my integrity by turning my ship into a prison. If that means you relieve me of command, so be it. At least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror." The room fell silent. Finally, Ross spoke quietly. "Captain Picard, you're one of Starfleet's most experienced commanders. We need you, but we also need unity of command and adherence to security protocols. Can you find a middle ground?" Picard considered this. He could compromise, enforce the major security directives while quietly undermining the most egregious ones. He could work within the system to preserve what he could of the old Federation. Or he could resign in protest and watch someone else take the Enterprise who'd enforce every directive without question. "I'll enforce directives I deem essential to ship security," he said finally. "But I reserve the right to interpret what's essential. If you want a puppet captain who'll follow orders without judgment, you can find someone else." It wasn't a victory, but it was survival, which seemed to be all the Federation offered anymore. Months passed. The Federation continued its transformation from exploratory alliance to militarized state. The emergency powers remained in effect. Military administration of liberated worlds extended indefinitely. The intelligence apparatus's authority expanded into civilian governance. The Federation Council found itself increasingly sidelined, reduced to rubber-stamping decisions made by the Strategic Defense Council, and the citizens of the Federation accepted it. Some out of genuine fear that the Imperials would return, others out of exhaustion they'd survived apocalyptic war and couldn't summon the energy to fight against their own government's overreach. Still others because the changes were gradual enough that each step seemed reasonable in context, even as the cumulative effect was transformation into something unrecognizable. President Thel, who'd led the Federation through its darkest hour, stood before the Council 1 year after the ceasefire and delivered a speech that would define her legacy. "We survived," she said, her voice carrying to representatives from 100 worlds. "Against an enemy that sought our extinction, we survived. We adapted, we fought, we sacrificed, and we endured. The Federation stands, bloodied but unbroken." She paused, looking out at faces that reflected exhaustion, relief, and unspoken questions about the cost of survival. But survival came at a price. We compromised principles we thought were inviolable. We authorized actions that would have been unthinkable before the war. We gave emergency powers to military and intelligence apparatus that we haven't fully reclaimed, and in doing so, we changed. Fundamentally, irrevocably, we became something different from what we were. The question before us now is simple. Who are we? Are we still the Federation of Planets, built on principles of peace, exploration, and cooperation? Or have we become something else, a militarized state that uses fear and security as justification for authoritarian control? She looked directly at the unnamed representatives from the intelligence community sitting in the observers section. "I propose that we begin the process of restoring civilian governance. The emergency powers granted during the war should be reviewed and, where no longer necessary, revoked. Military administration of liberated worlds should transition to civilian government within 2 years. The expanded security apparatus should be rolled back to its pre-war scope. And we should recommit ourselves to the principles that founded this Federation not as naive idealism, but as practical necessity. Because if we've learned anything from this war, it's that we can't become our enemies without losing everything worth fighting for." The debate that followed was fierce. Some representatives supported immediate restoration of civilian rule. Others argued that the imperial threat remained existential and emergency powers must continue. The intelligence community's supporters warned that premature demilitarization would leave the Federation vulnerable when the Imperials inevitably returned. The vote, when it finally came, was razor-thin. By a margin of 3 votes, the Federation Council authorized a gradual restoration of civilian governance to be completed over 5 years. Emergency powers would remain in place but subject to annual review. Military administration would transition to civilian control on a case-by-case basis. The intelligence apparatus would retain authority over military intelligence but lose its expanded civilian oversight. It wasn't a return to the old Federation, but it was a step away from the abyss. On the Enterprise F, Picard received notification of the Council's decision and felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope, faint fragile hope that the Federation might remember what it was supposed to be. "Captain," Data reported from the science station. "I am detecting a message beacon approaching our position. It's transmitting on old Imperial frequencies." Picard felt his blood run cold. On screen, the view screen showed a small automated probe, scarred and battered, broadcasting a repeating message in High Gothic. The Universal Translator rendered it in Federation Standard. "To the Xenos who call themselves Federation, the crusade is not over. We withdraw to gather strength. We will return with the full might of the Imperium behind us. Prepare yourselves. The God Emperor's judgment is merely delayed, not averted. You have perhaps a decade before we return in numbers you cannot defeat. Use that time wisely. It will be your last." The message ended. The probe self-destructed to prevent capture. Picard stood on his bridge, surrounded by his crew, and contemplated the future. The Federation had a decade, maybe less, to prepare for the Imperial's return. A decade to rebuild their shattered fleets. A decade to develop new weapons and strategies. A decade to heal the wounds the war had inflicted on their civilization. But they'd also have a decade to forget why they'd fought in the first place. A decade for emergency powers to become permanent. A decade for the militarized Federation to become the only Federation anyone remembered. "Inform Starfleet Command," Picard ordered quietly, "and begin long-range scans for any signs of dimensional instability. If they're coming back, we'll be ready. But we'll be ready as the Federation, not as a pale imitation of the Imperium." He didn't know if that was possible. Didn't know if the Federation could prepare for existential war while preserving the principles that made it worth defending. But he had to try. They all did. Because the alternative, becoming so much like their enemies that victory became meaningless, was worse than any defeat. The war had ended. The Federation had survived. But the battle for its soul was just beginning, and that was a war that might take generations to resolve. In the Calandra sector, near the sealed rift, automated sensors continued their vigil, waiting, watching, preparing for the day when the Imperium of Man would return to finish what they'd started. And in the depths of the warp, 10,000 light-years away in a dimension the Federation barely understood, the Imperium marshaled its forces, built new ships, trained new navigators, planned new strategies. The Xenos had won a battle, but the war, the eternal war that had raged for 10,000 years, was far from over. The Federation had learned to fight. Now they would learn to live with the consequences of that education, forever changed by a war that had tested everything they believed in and found some of those beliefs wanting. The age of exploration was dead. The age of survival had begun, and no one knew if the Federation would emerge from it still recognizably itself, or as something else entirely, something that had sacrificed its soul to preserve its existence. Time would tell. But time was running out.